I find myself in the unenviable position of following several just terrific speakers. And I am a dry economics professor. So I appreciate that. So I'll try to keep my remarks succinct. And I'll just try to elaborate and try to provide some structure for a lot of the facts that other speakers have so much more eloquently than I could say have already said. So the service sector is large and it's diverse. And I think that that makes people uncomfortable about talking about it. So maybe this is like kind of like AA. So I talk about services a lot. So let me tell you about how I talk about services. I talk about business services. It's a part of services that everyone else has alluded to today. You know, it's information, right? So that's telecom, software, motion pictures, it's finance, it's insurance, professional, scientific, and technical, right? Architects, engineers, attorneys, accountants, and it's administrative support, okay? Which may sound niche, right? How big could that be? Right? It's 24% of the U.S. labor force. That's almost 3 times the size of the manufacturing sector. Okay, so just let that sink in. Right, so that's what we're talking about here. 24% of the U.S. labor force is in those high-skill business services. These jobs are not crappy service jobs, right? These jobs pay on average over 20% more than the average manufacturing job. Right? Average wages in the most recent economic census in business services was something like $65,000. Okay, so these are good jobs, and this sector is growing. Okay, and as we've all talked about this morning, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, this stuff is tradable. Okay, services now account for 30% of U.S. exports, and we can, you know, is that glass half full or half empty? It's pretty big. I mean, it's big enough where policymakers should be paying attention. It's big enough where it shouldn't be captive to dairy and car parts. Right? Part of the problem is we don't measure it well, so it's hard to talk about. So for goods trade, you know, we get pretty detailed information for 10,000 product categories for every country monthly from the Census Bureau. For services trade, we get 30 categories quarterly. Okay, so it's just harder to talk about. Okay, so I've spent some time trying to think about, well, could we use existing data to fill in the picture? And I think that I can credibly claim that, yeah, we can identify what's tradable within the U.S. Within that business service sector, more than half of that 24% of the labor force is in activities that appear to be traded, and traded within the United States and tradable internationally. So tradable business services are larger than the entire manufacturing sector. Okay? And these tradable service jobs pay even higher wages than business services overall. Okay? In part because the workers in these activities are qualitatively different. Okay? They're highly skilled. They're twice as likely as a manufacturing worker to have a college degree. They're twice as likely as a worker in non-tradable business services to have a college degree. They're more than twice as likely than either manufacturing or non-tradable business services to have an advanced degree. Okay, so these are highly skilled people. As Undersecretary Selig said this morning, the U.S. is still a really skill-abundant place. So we have comparative advantage in these skill-intensive activities. Okay, we should be exporting these things, right? We do run a consistent trade surplus in services, and it's growing, and it's big. But if we look kind of under the covers, if we look at export participation by service firms, or if we look at exports to sales ratios for the service sector, it lags the manufacturing sector, where I would argue we do not really have comparative advantage, significantly. If we look at exporters, the share of exporters within manufacturing, about 25% of manufacturing establishments export. Within business services, only 5% of service firms, service establishments export. Okay, much lower. If we look at exports to sales ratios, in manufacturing, we export about 20% of US manufacturing output. In tradable business services, we only export about 4%. Okay, so that lags. Now, culture and language might be more important in services, but I believe, and I think the people on this panel believe, that policy impediments are an important reason for this underperformance, for this lack of engagement. Right, the US is relatively open. There are some notable exceptions, but largely open. Emerging markets, in particular, are much less so. Okay? These kinds of impediments are hard to measure, but work done by the OECD and the World Bank all suggest that emerging markets have much higher barriers to services trade than developed economies. Okay, so the BRICS, right? And while the BRICS are not party to TPP, there are some countries that are BRIC-like, right? That are big, they're fast growing, and they have levels of economic development where our comparative advantage is quite pronounced. So Vietnam and Malaysia, right? Together, about 120 million people. Right? That's not small, right? These are good markets for US service exports, and our service exports will help these economies further develop. So it's a win-win. Right? Okay, as people have spoken about it, the issue is not tariffs, instead it's this thicket of regulation, tax policy, procurement practices, professional guilds, all sorts of things that stand in the way of US firms exporting services. As a researcher, it's difficult to identify which practices are the biggest impediments. Right, as I said, the data on what's being traded is kind of crummy. It's really hard to measure what the policy impediments are. Right? It's not a tariff rate. Right? And it's complicated. It's not just a tariff. There's this web, this thicket of regulation, practice, all sorts of things that make it difficult. I mean, let's think about, we talk about the modes of services trade, right? 4 modes. Mode 1, cross-border trade. Mode 2, consumption abroad. Right? Mode 3 is foreign direct investment or commercial presence, and mode 4 is movement of natural persons. And then we talk about those as if they're distinct. As if one company does mode 1, another company does mode 2, another company does mode 3, and a different company does mode 4. So that it's only regulation that impedes mode 2. If I don't do mode 2, I don't have to worry about it. As I study this, I'm increasingly convinced that all of these channels have to be open for effective services exports. So I think about my industry, higher education, right? We need all of those channels to be working, right? We need students from foreign countries to come here to the United States, to come to Georgetown, to the Hilltop, and be students. That's an export of services. That's mode 2. Okay? We need to send faculty abroad, right? As part of our residencies. We need to send them to places. We need to establish physical presence in some foreign countries, right? We have a campus in Qatar. That's mode 3. Okay, mode 1 is increasingly we deliver stuff over the internet. That's mode 1. Right, so for us to be viable as a global competitor in higher ed, we need all 4 modes to be working. Right? And we need data to move. We need people to move, right? Both our faculty and students, okay? So we need all these things to work. We need ancillary considerations. We need intellectual property protection. We need data flows, right? TPP makes important progress on several of these fronts, right? It's a big step forward, big step forward. And it provides a mechanism for other large Asian and Pacific countries to join into a high-quality agreement. And right, this is the long game, right? If we don't do TPP, if this falls apart, what comes? how are we going to negotiate with China and India? Right? This puts a stake in the ground. It's a high quality agreement that other nations can aspire to and join into. Okay? And I think we've seen that this is an important mechanism. Right? When China decides that they need a more robust service sector to continue their economic development, and I believe the Chinese policymakers are coming to that conclusion, they may very well view TPP as an excellent way, as they view WTO accession, to roll domestic constituencies, join the TPP, and liberalize their service sector. Okay? And I think that that's aspirational. That's always been part of the aspiration for TPP, and I think that that's a wonderful goal. So I can't resist. You know, this is a big step forward, but as people have said, it doesn't do everything. And it was a couple of the questions of Undersecretary Sella raised one of the issues, which is visas. Right, Mode 2 and Mode 4 rely on visas. If we can't get visas sorted out, my industry, we're in a world of hurt. Okay, so why there is this huge gulf between who manages visa policy and who manages trade policy, but they need to be addressed. And that's professional certifications, some kind of notion of mutual recognition, and then regulatory convergence, or harmonization, or accommodation, or whatever you want to call it, some way that regulatory regimes that are very similar can be recognized by the counterparty. And I was delighted to hear that WITA is going to do an event on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, because that strikes me as the appropriate venue to set the global standard for rules on visas, mutual recognition, and regulatory convergence. And that would be a huge missed opportunity if we can't get that done in TTIP.